picture a simple bowl of water, just sitting outside on a table on a bright, hot summer day.
Right. And if you leave it there long enough, the sun beats down on it and
Eventually,
eventually
it's completely empty. Exactly. The
yeah.
water evaporated, but we understand that the water didn't just die.
No, it just transitioned.
Right. It turned into vapor. Maybe it joins a cloud drifting overhead, and eventually, it's going to fall back down as rain somewhere else.
It's the exact same water, just taking on a completely different form.
Yeah, and that basic law of conservation is something we all instinctively understand about nature. Like, nothing is truly lost, it just changes states.
But today, we're taking that exact same concept and applying it to human consciousness.
Yes, to every single living being in the universe, which is a huge leap.
It really is. It requires a profound shift in perspective. You have to stop looking at birth and death as, a concrete beginning and a definitive end.
Right.
And you start seeing them simply as changes in a state of matter, all within a closed system.
Well, welcome to a custom-tailored deep dive into a framework that tries to map out exactly how that system works. For you listening, we're jumping into a fascinating 2011 text by Lifechanyuan.
Yeah, it's titled 8 Secrets on Life in Samsara.
And for anyone who might not be fully steeped in Eastern philosophy, samsara is traditionally understood as the continuous, somewhat aimless cycle of birth, everyday existence, death, and rebirth.
It's basically the wheel we're all supposedly stuck on.
Exactly. But what we are doing today is decoding a framework that attempts to explain the literal structural mechanics of that wheel.
What makes this particular framework stand out is its ambitious scope. It doesn't just rely on ancient mysticism.
No.
It weaves together grounded natural science analogies, like the water cycle you just mentioned, but then it pulls in biblical references, Jesus' parables, and blends them with Eastern concepts of Buddhahood.
It's wild. It is essentially trying to create a unified field theory of cosmic order, to explain why existence is structured the way it is, why human society behaves the way it does, and what reincarnation literally looks like behind the curtain.
Yeah, the foundational premise of this entire worldview starts with Secret One, which is a mathematical absolute. The total number of lives in the universe is completely fixed.
Completely fixed. Which is crazy. It's a closed system, just like the water cycle.
Right.
Which immediately made me think about population growth. Because, if we see the human population suddenly spike on Earth, going from 1 billion to 8 billion really quickly, the automatic assumption is that new souls are just being created.
Oh, sure. But under this framework, there is absolutely no soul factory churning out new consciousness.
There are no new lives whatsoever.
Right. If there's a population boom among humans, the math demands that those lives simply transferred from a different sector of the universe.
So where do they come from?
Well, they might have reincarnated from the animal kingdom, migrating up into human form, or transferred from a lower plane, like what some traditions call hell, or even from the foundational plant layer.
Oh, wow. So the total volume of consciousness remains identical across the cosmos.
Exactly. So if human numbers increase drastically, it forces a decrease somewhere else. Maybe certain animal populations dwindle,
Yeah.
It's a constant churning equation trying to maintain equilibrium.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that logic introduces a structural rule secret too that seems incredibly bleak at first glance.
Yeah, it can sound a bit harsh.
The framework poses that the lower a life's level is, the greater its quantity must be. The universe is just a massive bottom-heavy pyramid.
Meaning there are inevitably more insects than birds.
Right, more grass than there are herbivores to eat it. And naturally, mortals must outnumber celestial beings.
It's a structural necessity for stability, honestly.
Yeah.
Imagine a physical pyramid. If the top is heavier than the base, it immediately collapses.
That makes sense.
The universe operates on that exact same hierarchical blueprint. You absolutely need a massive foundation to support the higher, more refined levels of existence.
But wait, when I was going through the source material, I noticed a massive mathematical paradox that seems to just break that very rule.
Oh, the celestial numbers.
Yeah. The text explicitly claims there are about 30 billion supercelestial beings residing in higher dimensions versus the roughly 8 billion humans currently on Earth.
Right.
So if the fundamental rule is that lower levels always have higher populations, how can the higher level celestials outnumber us nearly 4 to 1?
Well, that paradox is actually resolved by shifting how we measure time within this cosmic system. We tend to look at population from a static perspective.
Like a snapshot of right now?
Exactly, yes. In this exact millisecond, 30 billion celestial beings outnumber 8 billion humans. But the framework argues those 30 billion supercelestial beings haven't changed in hundreds of millions of years.
Oh, I see.
Their population is totally static. They've reached a state of equilibrium. They aren't dying and being reborn every 80 years like we are.
So they are essentially outside the churn of the water cycle. They are like water locked in a deep underground aquifer that never sees the sun.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. Whereas the human population is incredibly dynamic and volatile.
Constantly evaporating and raining back down.
Right, if you measure that same time period, hundreds of millions of years, the total number of human lives cycling in and out, numbers in the trillions upon trillions.
Wow, okay. So from a dynamic, overarching perspective, the lower level of humans vastly outnumbers the static, higher level of celestials.
Yeah, it comes down to the basic principle of scarcity. Things of higher refined value are always scarcer in the grand timeline.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the framework actually pulls in a concept from Jesus Christ.
Oh, right, the narrow gate.
Exactly. Noting that the road taken by great numbers inevitably leads to destruction, or in this context, lower life spaces, while only a tiny fraction find the narrow way to a higher life.
Which logically implies that simply following the crowd is mathematically proven to be a terrible strategy for spiritual survival.
Yeah, because if the universe is a bottom-heavy pyramid, it means the vast majority of consciousness is at the base. This brings us to Secret 3.
And it takes us to its logical, somewhat uncomfortable conclusion. Bad people, or ignorant people, must inherently outnumber good or enlightened people. Sages will always be outnumbered by ordinary mortals.
It's wild, but it removes the moral judgment from human behavior entirely. It just frames it as a structural reality.
Right, think about how a functional human society operates.
Right.
You inherently need more common workers than you have middle managers.
Definitely.
And you need more managers than city mayors, more mayors than provincial governors. And ultimately, all of those millions of people form a pyramid pointing to a single president.
Because if you try to invert that, like if you have a society with 1 million presidents and 10 common workers, the entire system shatters. Nothing functions.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? If we are navigating this massive bottom-heavy pyramid, it sounds incredibly difficult to move upward. The sheer weight of the numbers is just against you.
It is.
It feels like there's a pervasive spiritual gravity at play, like it is infinitely easier to just let go and roll down a steep hill than it is to strap on climbing gear and claw your way up.
Spiritual gravity is the defining challenge here, which brings us to Secret 4. The text explains the mechanics of this gravity by stating it's far easier to appease the flesh than to sublimate the soul.
Let's break down that phrase, sublimate the soul, because it sounds incredibly abstract at first. But in chemistry, sublimation is when a solid turns directly into a gas, bypassing the liquid phase entirely.
Becoming less dense.
Lighter.
Lighter. And that chemical definition maps perfectly onto the spiritual concept. To sublimate the soul is to shed the dense, heavy attachments of the material world.
Things like greed, ego, purely physical desires.
Yeah, these act as literal weights tying your consciousness to the base of the pyramid. Appeasing the flesh is just giving into gravity. It requires zero effort.
I mean, in human society, it takes massive discipline to become a genuine role model, but it takes almost no effort to just be selfish. Sinking is the path of least resistance.
Right, and what I found deeply unsettling about this framework is that this downward pull isn't usually the result of some dramatic, villainous choice.
No, you don't have to decide to be evil to sink. It happens entirely unconsciously, simply by adopting the default values of the masses.
The text specifically calls out everyday behaviors, like if you focus all your life's energy solely on making money.
Or just blindly conforming to traditional life paths, like assuming your only purpose is to grow up, find a spouse, have kids, and settle down just because your neighbors are doing it.
Exactly, you're aligning yourself with the bottom of the pyramid. Because the masses, by definition, represent a high quantity but a low quality of life space.
When you adopt their priorities without questioning them, your consciousness just becomes dense. You match their frequency.
But very few people actively seek out higher frequencies. Because ordinary human consciousness carries massive inertia. We crave the safety of the herd.
That inertia leads directly into Secret 5. Which is one of the most stubborn rules in this entire text. The idea that a leopard cannot change its spots.
Oh yeah, the rigid nature of things.
The framework argues that nature is fundamentally rigid. Peonies, lotuses, cattle, sheep, they have remained completely unchanged in their core nature for thousands of years.
Right, a sheep doesn't meditate and become a wolf.
Exactly. The underlying physical law here is that without external forces, material simply will not change its state.
And that is the critical mechanism for any kind of upward mobility. You cannot pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
So self-help is at the window.
Pretty much. Without the active guidance and the magnetic pull from a higher consciousness, be it a celestial, a Buddha, a god, or an enlightened teacher, a human being will essentially remain a human being.
Endlessly recycling in that same dynamic loop.
Or, due to that spiritual gravity, they'll slowly sink lower. So surrounding yourself with people who are exactly like you is basically a trap.
You are just a leopard trying to scrub off your own spots with a dry brush.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
The framework insists you need an external tow rope. You have to locate those rare individuals who already operate with a higher consciousness and let their frequency pull you upward.
It requires a fundamental shift you just can't generate in isolation, which naturally shifts the focus to the literal moment of transition.
The final exam.
Right. Let's assume you spend decades fighting that spiritual gravity. What actually happens when you die?
Well, this is Secret 6, and the grading rubric for this exam is terrifyingly strict. The framework states that the direction of your next incarnation is determined strictly by the state of your consciousness at the exact moment of dying.
It introduces this concept of a non-material structure. As I understand it, it's like a spiritual DNA blueprint that your consciousness shapes over time.
Yes. And if your non-material structure matches the frequency of an animal at the moment you leave your body, say you're consumed entirely by base survival instincts or raw anger, you are drawn down to the animal realm.
But if you attain the serene consciousness of a celestial being, you float up.
Right. It operates purely on resonance. There's no judge with a gavel. It's just a natural sorting mechanism based on the density of your consciousness, like oil and water separating.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. My immediate, slightly cynical thought was, well, I'll just live however I want, and then right on my deathbed, I'll just meditate really hard.
The ultimate loophole.
Yeah, I'll force myself to think like a Buddha. But the framework explicitly closes that door. It states clearly that you cannot cram for this final exam.
No, you really can't. A sudden leap like that violates the laws of physics this system is built on. The framework explains that a qualitative change moving from water to vapor cannot happen without a massive accumulation of tiny quantitative changes.
You cannot overcome a lifetime of accumulated spiritual gravity in 3 minutes of deep breathing.
It's like trying to deadlift a 1,000-pound boulder when you've never even picked up a dumbbell in your life. You simply don't have the accumulated muscular structure.
To explain why this is impossible, the text highlights a really profound diagnostic rule. Consciousness develops toward where its treasures lie.
Yes, you cannot attain a higher quality of life in a celestial realm if you haven't painstakingly accumulated any treasure there.
And treasure here means focus, energy, and spiritual investment. Where your treasure lies, your heart will inevitably be. You fall toward what you value most.
So if your treasure was your stock portfolio or your social status, your consciousness is firmly anchored to the material plane.
It just can't float upward. And speaking of the things we accumulate, we have to talk about Secret 7, how this framework handles the physical records of all these lifetimes.
The imprints.
Yeah. It argues that we carry the history of our past reincarnations with us in incredibly literal biological ways. It claims that literal DNA acts as a hard drive carrying genetic information across different incarnations.
It invites us to view the human form as a sort of living geological record. The text draws a direct analogy to a geologist studying rock formations.
Oh, that's fascinating.
A trained geologist can look at a cliff face and read millions of years of history, right? When there was a flood, when the pressure shifted. In the exact same way, a person's physical tics and deeply ingrained behaviors are all sedimentary layers of their past lives.
It's totally a Sherlock Holmes approach to reincarnation.
Yes, exactly.
Holmes could look at a smudge of mud on a shoe and deduce which neighborhood a suspect walked through. The text suggests that a true master of detail could observe your current words, deeds, and appearance, and deduce whether you were previously a prey animal, a predator, or maybe fell from a celestial plane.
Every past fear leaves a visible imprint, which logically means that if your goal is to ascend to a higher realm, the work of this lifetime is to actively overwrite that old code.
But this creates a massive thematic bridge. If we are carrying around all of this deeply ingrained DNA and behavioral tics from thousands of past lives, why don't we have any conscious memory of it?
Right, the obvious question.
If my consciousness was mauled by a tiger 3 lifetimes ago, why don't I remember the tiger?
This is where Secret 8 comes in. Introducing the mystery of Mengpo soup.
Mengpo soup.
Yes, in Chinese mythology, Mengpo is the Lady of Forgetfulness. The text references the Sutra of Hell's King, which describes how souls that qualify to reincarnate into the mortal world have to drink a bowl of this soup, sometimes translated as ecstasy soup, right before they transition.
So it acts as a complete wipe of the conscious memory drive, a total factory reset of the mind before you boot up in a new body.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is the philosophical framing of this memory wipe. Our modern instinct is to view memory loss as a tragedy.
Or a punishment.
Right.
Right.
But within this cosmic system, the Mengpo soup is described as an act of immense necessary compassion. It's a protective firewall designed to maintain the dynamic balance of the universe.
Because when you play out the hypothetical scenario the text provides, the necessity of that firewall is honestly terrifying.
Oh, it really is.
Imagine the utter apocalyptic social collapse that would happen if we didn't drink the soup. Imagine walking into a coffee shop tomorrow, locking eyes with the barista, and suddenly remembering with absolute clarity that they were a mortal enemy who tortured you in a previous century.
Or sitting down at dinner and realizing your spouse was actually your grandmother in a past life.
Or that your beloved dog used to be your child.
Human society would become instantly, fundamentally unthinkable. I mean, every interpersonal relationship would shatter under the weight of conflicting loyalties and ancient grudges.
We would be completely unable to function. We'd just be paralyzed by the data.
The mortal world would immediately descend into violent chaos. Therefore, the framework concludes that the lower the life form, the more thoroughly their conscious memory must be wiped.
The denser the realm, the thicker the firewall needs to be.
And this is where the author brilliantly circles back to biblical teachings. It brings up the historical accounts of Jesus speaking in parables. When his disciples asked him why he didn't just speak plainly, he explicitly said he spoke in parables so that the masses may see but not perceive, and hearing they may hear but not understand.
He was literally encrypting the data, because if the masses completely understood the raw, unencrypted truth of the universe, if they suddenly possess full awareness of all their past lives and the exact mechanics of spiritual gravity, it would short-circuit the human experience.
It would cause massive societal conflicts. These are cosmic codes that simply cannot be revealed randomly to a population that isn't spiritually prepared to process them.
So the firewall of forgetfulness is quite literally what allows us to wake up, go to work, and live our daily lives.
It isolates your focus. It forces you to concentrate entirely on the current life, giving you the space to make those tiny quantitative changes we discussed earlier.
Wow. So as we wrap up this deep dive, take a moment to look at the incredible mechanical journey we've just walked through. We started with the realization that every single one of us is part of a fixed cosmic water cycle of souls.
Nobody is entirely new. We're all just changing states of matter.
Exactly. And we explored the massive, inherently bottom-heavy pyramid of existence and recognized the intense spiritual gravity that constantly pulls us downward when we just blindly follow the masses.
We examine the strict physics of the final exam, realizing you cannot cram for enlightenment. And that you will naturally fall toward wherever you have stored your spiritual treasure.
And then looking at those geological imprints in our spiritual DNA. And finally, the profound compassion behind the firewall of forgetfulness.
The real utility of keeping these 8 secrets in mind isn't really about proving whether it's empirically true or false. It's about how it provides a completely new, clarifying lens for viewing the behavior of crowds in daily life.
It definitely does. When you observe chaotic or destructive patterns in society, it suddenly makes mechanical sense. You can actually see the spiritual gravity they are caught in.
It's a reminder of the massive effort required to move against that gravity and sublimate your own soul.
It changes how you look at the world. Which brings me to one final thought for you to ponder long after we wrap up today. Think back to that Sherlock Holmes analogy.
The master observer.
Right. The idea that someone could deduce the history of your past lives just by studying your current physical form and behavior. Try turning that magnifying glass inward.
That's a powerful exercise.
Look past your conscious memories. Look at your deepest, most ingrained habits. Think about those highly specific, irrational fears you have that make absolutely no sense based on your current lifetime.
Or those unexplainable natural talents you just possess without practicing.
Exactly. If those traits are genuinely the sedimentary layers of your non-material structure, what do those subtle clues suggest about exactly what or who you were right before you took your sip of Mengpo soup? Just like that bowl of water evaporating in the summer sun, the bowl might look empty. But nothing is ever truly gone. It just changes form.